So we're now going to turn it over to Peter and the rest of the panel, and they're going to join us on stage. And as they come up, I just want you to think about two of the things that have come up, first with Peter and then with Erica, in saying that you need to apply. It's unlikely that you will get what you ask for the first time out of the gate, and that should not. So every time that you write a proposal, I'd like you to maybe start to think about it in a different way. Think about it as, this is a way for me to articulate what I do and the meaning of what I do and why people should care about what I do to a more general audience. It can only help you in all of your interactions with potential partners, with funders, but with the general public as well. And so if you don't get the funding out of the gate, apply again. And if you're nervous about starting with something huge, we're here to help you, even if it's a $500 grant. We're here, so we'll help you get through that. So I invite the panelists to come up onto stage, and then we're going to open it up for questions. We have 2 mics. It should be town hall. Have at it, folks. The hard part.
Just get myself organised. Yeah. Well, thank you for the presentations, and I've just been asked to chair the second part of this session, which is really about opening it up to the audience. We've heard from, I think, hopefully 4, including myself, but really it was really fascinating to hear the other stories and the other projects, because, I think we've learned a lot about really diverse kinds of research, but there are some really common points that we've come back to all the time. I mean, the question of relationships seems to be reoccurring in all of the stories that we heard. The question of the imagination, I'm so pleased you brought up the word imagination, because sometimes I think when we're talking about grants, we can get ourselves into a kind of framework of thinking that says, well, we must fit the criteria, so we'll have to bend what we do to fit certain norms that have been established by other institutions and other boards. But in fact, we do this work to get the grants so we can do the work that we want to do. And I think that idea of thinking about where you want to take the work is really, really important. And the enthusiasm that you have for your project, I think, will also mean that you can communicate that enthusiasm to other people. And so in that way, you'll also be able to become a really good advocate for the work that you want to do. It's very important that we don't just think in terms of kind of neoliberal norms of using horrible institutional language to describe what we do. We do this in order to do the work that we need to do as researchers and as artists, and so I think that was a very important point. The question also of the question of working in the international context in a time when international institutions are very often perhaps less open to partnerships than they once were, and I think we can kind of scale that across, whether we're talking about possibilities for institutional thinking between organisations within cities or within states or within nations. These are very important challenges that I think we have to address. And very often the answer is coming back to having a good team and making those partnerships and making sure that you work together with your partners to keep the conversation alive, to keep the enthusiasm for the project alive, and that you work out strategies to deal with some of the questions about inclusion and equity and participation along the way, so that you make sure that everybody's feeling that they're a part of the project, and that while at various times 1 or 2 people might take the lead on certain tasks like writing a section of a grant application, there needs to be really good feedback loops, I think, back to the team that you have to make sure that everybody feels like they're a part of it. And I think finally the question of research ethics was really in behind some of the conversations that we were having here, the need to be doing work that is structured in such a way that it meets the kind of ethical protocols of the university, but it's also driven by certain kinds of ethical imperatives. Again, coming back to the idea of research not as just something that means that you sit in a library and research ancient texts, or not that there's anything, that's also an important research agenda, but it's an activist agenda. So a lot of the stories we heard were taking the research in directions that had visible applications and really transforming applications for the context that the research takes place in, really transforming context for the community that the City of University of New York is in. And so we also saw some across the spectrum from perhaps so-called blue sky research that is very open-ended in its inquiries and in its questions, and then right through the spectrum to very specific, targeted research to address very particular problems of our time. So really interesting, and thank you all for the presentations. As I said, it's my job to facilitate a kind of discussion here. So I'll begin with just a discussion with the panelists, but if anybody wants to step in at any time, please do so, because really the purpose of this session is to open it up for people here to ask questions of the panelists who have all been successful in getting research grants. So really it's about a story of how we can help you think about how you can develop your grants as well. So I guess just to begin to get people warmed up, I'd like to come back to this question of internationalization that you were talking about, and just talk about some of the strategies that you're working with that might, how are you dealing with the fact that there are very significant challenges now with kind of the way that you conduct research in relation to the international sphere?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Well, I'll tell you one quick story about one of our Iranian students. She had come over, she had worked with us in the MFA program, getting her Master's of Fine Arts degree, was graduated working in the local museum, which we have at Queens College, which is inside the college, the Goodwin Turnback Museum, and as just an assistant. So she was working on getting her work visa from her student visa, and that's when the so-called Muslim ban hit. And suddenly her, legal team said, look, you can't leave the country. It's not clear whether you can even stay. What we did was we then launched the certificate program which I had designed a few years earlier and had been waiting for the right moment, and then enrolled her again as a student immediately. And that basically kept her from, being probably deported, and we've kept her kind of going since then. It's still a struggle. I mean, she is still waiting for her green card, which she's got all the paperwork done for, and it's like supposed to have come, but didn't come. So it's really a difficult time working with the students. But that's a very particular case. My sense was, and I'm not sure if other people feel this way, is that people are not applying from overseas to the extent that they were. I mean, we definitely had a really big drop-off because we had people through Fulbrights, we had people from all around the world pretty much, except from Northern Europe. And suddenly it just sort of stopped. And I'd be very curious to know if other people have those experiences as well.
Great, thank you. We'll come back to that question, I think. Sonia, I wanted to ask a question about team building, because your project was very much, you spoke a lot about that. And how did you learn to build the team? Or how did you learn to participate in the building of the team? What did you learn from, what kind of tips can you give us about that? Because you're a very ambitious project, a lot of involvement from various people. How did you deal with all the stakeholders and all of the expectations?
Yeah, there were so many different layers to the project. The project team, as I had described earlier, and then the participants, and then the speakers who were, as I had said earlier, a mix of scholars, artists, organizers, and often they were in, mixed settings, like mixed panel discussions or roundtables or presenting together. So there was a lot of, micro relationship building that had to happen so that people who were working together who maybe hadn't met each other before could feel comfortable to then, for a temporary amount of time, collectively, work together. I think there was this balance of pacing things quickly and slowly. So a lot had to happen to create the structure or the container connecting people, communicating across, but then also being patient and flexible to allow people to, actually get to connect and know each other. So we had a mix of formal and informal spaces. Our project team met very regularly, and sometimes, we had meetings where we didn't really have an agenda because nothing was time sensitive, but we would meet anyway, just so that we would have this regular interaction. And oftentimes the meetings that didn't have agendas became the longest meetings because once we were in person, we realized there was a lot to talk about. So I think just having patience and commitment to knowing each other, more holistically was something that we all came in with. So then I think there was, buy-in and participation across the different types of, different combinations of people. And I think some of the project was, I had mentioned earlier that we were trying to build a locally relevant Asian American studies, and part of what that meant was that we were thinking, building off of some of what Erica said, it was important for us to see what was happening in the classroom as not just located in the classroom, but to really see Asian American studies as something continuous from the classroom through into communities, and to really understand better the relationship of what happens outside the classroom to what we're learning in that classroom space. And part of that was building relationships with local organizations. So I think some of that was just, thinking about how to support a network over time so that everything didn't have to happen in that 1 week. But some of it was just planting the seeds for longer-term relationships. Yeah.
Important, thank you. Erica, I was very interested in thinking about the practicalities of translating what is a community project or an activist project into a research project, and how you negotiate the pathway from working, in this community setting and then translating those objectives into a set of research practices. Could you speak a little bit about that?
It is challenging. It is also incredibly fun. There's a couple things. The first is is the development of a kind of core set of students, undergraduate and graduate students, undergrad, masters, and doctoral students who are genuinely excited by the very concept of actually being in community. It is this kind of work and research is not the norm in psychology and in developmental psychology, and definitely not in my department. There are no, as I say to my students, we're not going to start a conversation with the word hypothesis. We're not going to be in lab coats. We're not going to use our kind of lab space in a way that is a laboratory. So that's the first, is developing a team of students who feel really excited by the concept of actually going outside of the kind of bounds of the school. The second is that we've been applying for a range of different types of grants to support it. So smaller grants like the PSC CUNY grants, as well as larger grants, which I'm still waiting to hear from one right now from the National Science Foundation, but I figure that even if I don't get it, it'll be good feedback for the next time that I submit it. The other really important part of it is, which has been a real learning process, is being in active conversation, like Sonia was saying, with youth workers and the individuals who are actually running the program kind of in the day-to-day, right? They're the people who are the incredible professionals who are with young people and are in their schools at lunchtime to recruit for programs, and who are handing out snack at 3 o'clock when everybody's totally starved and ready to eat something. And part of what we do in conversation is, before we start even developing or creating our surveys and our interviews for our research, is sitting down and saying, what are the things that you would love to know the most? Or what do you think is happening? Or what do you think makes these spaces special? So we start those conversations as opposed to us bringing something in first. The other thing that we do is that it is an iterative process. So every point in the process in which we are developing and creating measures and means of collecting data, we are having meetings, usually with snacks, which sounds well, I clearly hang out with a lot of 13-year-olds, but also snacks work for all of us. I mean, everybody was really excited to have the food out there. It's also, if you don't have them, the ideal is that you have money or funding to actually be able to reimburse people for their labor and their time and their knowledge and their expertise, including young people. When you don't have enough money to do that, there are other ways to do that. Food is one. Inviting young people to spaces that they might not otherwise be a part of, or opportunities, is another way to try to recognize the labor and time that they're committing, and same thing with youth workers. So we do that as well. And then after we actually collect data and analyze it, then we go back and develop reports or ways of talking about the data, and then we bring it back to the young people and to the youth workers and say, does this sound like at all like what you are experiencing? Or what did we miss completely? Was there a question that we didn't even know that we were supposed to ask, or was just the wrong question completely? So that's the kind of process, but it is ever ongoing.
Yeah. One of the things I'm taking away from, I think, all of the presentations is that all of us in some way have rethought within the project what constitutes research. So research is not just an article or a book or a conference paper, but it's actually a public event or an artwork or a gathering or a social practice project or a classroom. So with those thoughts in mind and you know, all the wisdom from the team, the panel, let's open it up to the floor. Would anybody like to ask a question? And I ask that you just use one of the microphones, because we're recording this session. So please.
Hi, my name is Sharona Levy from Brooklyn College. And I have a question really that sort of piggybacks on what you've just been talking about. And that is the nature or the need for institutional support and departmental support, especially if you're engaging in research that, or grants that may not in the end come into fruition, but also that may not be traditional in terms of research. And I'm not asking for any maybe horror stories, but just how do we negotiate those sorts of things? Because tenure, your job security, your time, which is often unpaid. I mean, all these things are important things. Thank you.
I mean, I guess I can say, so one of the things as a tenure-track junior faculty member that was utterly terrifying to me when Nancy asked me to kind of take over the helm a couple of years ago was exactly what you're saying. I do think that for those of you who know Nancy Romer, she's incredibly tenacious and a really wonderful force of nature. And so she had incredible clarity of vision of who she is, of the kind of scholar she is, and the kind of work she wants to do. She also had tenure at that point, which is just a reality, and she had built a number of relationships within the institution to help protect and propel and to allow the work to go forward. So and because of that, I've been able to benefit from the kind of existing institutional support. That doesn't mean that it isn't always still a struggle to maintain the institutional support. As we know, presidents change at colleges and provosts change at colleges, sometimes more quickly than others. Chancellors, everything is constantly in flux, so it is always a continuing process. I do think that one of the things that I learned very quickly was the need to not only build relationship, but actively seek and ask for senior allies. Because some of those relationships are relationships I didn't have. I'm not friends with anybody not that I'm not friends, but I don't have a buddy or a person in the registrar's office, for example, who might be able to help me with what sounds like a really basic problem, but is a really serious problem, which is how I get the specific space that I need during the time that I need to be able to run the programming that I need. And a lot of that for me has been seeking out those allies within my department, and that then I know that senior faculty members are also protecting the time and space related to that. So we use a fair amount of space within Brooklyn College through our department, and that is protected through, our chair is really great at helping to protect that space. But if I weren't actively building and asking, kind of explicitly asking for that support, I could see easily how that, it might be less visible and that it would be a lot more challenging to do the work.
That's a great question. I mean, Sharon, we were speaking before about this, so I'm going to be more circumspect than I was with you. But it is challenging, and part of it is, I think, developing and kind of mapping the ideology of the institution and where the safety zones are and the support is and where the problems are, where the obstacles are, and having that in mind and trying to find ways. Sometimes workarounds, as we all know, are necessary in CUNY. And yeah, I mean, I would just kind of reiterate that. Part of what we do, too, is where one foot is outside the institution with Queens Museum. So we have a little bit of sort of like space that we can kind of move off to. We even have a studio at Queens Museum that's dedicated to our students. So that's helped as well. Yeah.
I would just echo what was already said. I had an experience prior to the backstory for of me applying for the New York State Council for Humanities grant for other public programming was that I hit a lot of obstacles internally in the institution when I was trying to, I was new to the institution and made a lot of mistakes about thinking I understood how things worked, and I had a lot of, people saying no and blocks and calls from the administration and calls from my department chair. And so I learned the hard way that it's really important to have allies who know how to map, who can map and navigate with me the institution. So in this project, because the director for the Center for Ethnic Studies was part of our project team, one of her roles on the team was actually to facilitate negotiations with the institution to get institutional support internally. And then once some of those relationships were built, then I felt like I also had more ability to go directly myself to those administrators. But until she had facilitated those relationships, I didn't feel that comfort given my previous experience. So I think being slow and really trying to understand the dynamics of the place were important in my learning process, and then not doing it alone. The other one, yeah.
I'd just add that the institutional context and building those relationships with institutions is very important, but also understanding the nature of the grant process itself. What happens to the grant that you write? Who assesses it? What are the criteria? And this question of the likelihood that it might be funded or it might not be funded. And having served on a lot of different grant systems, there is a sense that people are always struggling to fund everything they want to fund when they're making those decisions. And very often there's a fine line between funding something and not funding it. And there's an expectation among the panel that they say, kind of makes themselves feel better perhaps, but they say, well, we bring it back next year. Let's see if it comes back. And there's an expectation that it will come back. And very often, I think, for nationally funded level grants, there's it takes 2 times, sometimes even 3. So I think it's a matter of learning from disappointments and using that knowledge to improve the grant and bring it back the next time. Don't give up.
I'm a playwright, poet, and adjunct professor at Bronx, but I have a different sort of question. I don't have the leverage as an adjunct professor at Bronx to really do stuff, but I've started and co-founded a theater group in the community on the Upper West Side called Crossways, a multicultural theater and such like that, a group of playwrights, theater people. One of our people is at City College as an assistant professor, but what is the best way to connect our community, our theater, to an institution when I'm not in a very strong position, let's say, to do something at Bronx as an adjunct professor? Are there any suggestions from you to do this? Okay.
Can I shoot a question back real quick for clarification?
Yes.
What is it that you want from the institution?
Well, we've worked with some of the students through the professor and such, but I think we want to do more. I'd like to see more of young theater people and such be associated with our theater along with the professionals who are doing things from that angle. I'm coming from a slightly different place. And I've worked with community institutions. In the 80s, I worked with something called Museums Collaborative, where we did stuff with museum institutions, projects, the Cooper Hewitt and the Met for older people. But how is the best way, or some suggestions, to facilitate this? That's my question. Thank you.
As I'm the theatre person, I think I can perhaps make some suggestions. It is a very challenging thing because typically theatre professors are dealing with theatre institutions who themselves are very badly funded. So you're often going to a theatre company that's struggling to pay the rent and saying, can you give us some money to do something? And they're going, well, we'd love to, but half the people here are interns, they're not being paid. So it's a particular challenge. Saying that, though, there are some positive sides, and one practical example that I can give is the people at Brooklyn College and their relationship with the Public Theatre in New York, and the way that was actually developed through the playwriting program at Brooklyn College as a kind of incubator for young and emerging writers. Now, it's a kind of, public theatre needs to access a new generation of audience and artists. So they're an established organisation. They have a public role. They have a need to communicate diversely with the community and the citizens of New York. And so for them, hooking up with Brooklyn is a very positive outcome because they can access young and emerging artists, but they can also access the future generation of audience potentially for their performances. For Brooklyn College, it's an opportunity to link up with a very established institution that has a lot of really good playwriting skills, really good playwriting chops, so they can really benefit in their playwriting program from having access to people who are not only leading playwrights such as Susan Laurie Parks, who's the head of playwriting there, but also some dramaturgical skills and even some work occasionally where it's a kind of, there's always the possibility that one will be discovered. And this is also the hope of young playwrights, that it'll be their play that will land on the desk of the director of the Public Theatre and they'll become the new person. But, that's how new plays get up. It's actually a very... the chance of that happening is not high, but that's what happens at the same time. So that's one very practical example, I think, of what you can do. What I do in my work is I work with partner artistic organisations, and we produce research outcomes that suit the needs of the academy and of the arts industry. And for me, that's always through the rubric of dramaturgy, and it's not, I'm not a person has an expertise in US theatre, but, my PhD's in Japanese studies, so it's usually with Japanese theatre companies, but I've done one or two projects with artists there that have been long-term, that have involved artists and scholars and produced seminars and practice-based outcomes with those people, as well as publications. So we kind of bring together a group of people who are participating in the question of theatre from these different perspectives and produce outcomes that they need. So I think it comes back to relationships and partnerships, look for the opportunities and build those links. Yeah.
I have one other thought, which is there are definitely kind of, the structural realities of navigating the institution as an adjunct. But I would go back to also the developing of relationships with kind of key partners on the campus who are there full-time, but also one of the thing that you have also is your classroom and your classroom space. So I think there are also possibilities for creative ways to think about how your theater group could be integrated into the the practice within your classroom potentially, I'm not sure. But if that might be one possibility, because that's one way that for us with BCCP that is a kind of that connecting point, as well as using that to communicate to the administration at the college level, the kind of concrete benefits in terms of specific opportunities and training provided to the students that is beyond what they might otherwise get in some of their other classes.
Just also to reverse the flow from America, maybe bring students to your group in the community and create a collaboration, maybe even an internship of some kind that you could work with.
Next question.
Yes, good morning. My name is Wallace Ford. I'm an associate professor at Medgar Evers College, and I just want to first of all just thank all of you for your presentation. I found them quite interesting. For Dr. Eckersall, questions for you, but it's really based on a comment that Dr. Shillette had made, which I really hadn't thought about in terms of the effects of he whose name shall not be spoken. Not only the immigration policies, but foreign policies and their impact on higher education here in the U.S. I really hadn't thought about that in some detail, and I really find it obviously of some real concern. But you had mentioned the notion of international partnerships for various research initiatives that could be part of what we could pursue here. And I'm just wondering, based upon the initial comment I was just making with respect to this foreign policy and immigration policy impacts on international higher educational initiatives, have you seen, or what are your thoughts are with respect to any real deleterious impact?
Well, I think the answer is quite contradictory. On the one hand, you've got political institutions creating, kind of ideological, performing a certain kind of a fear affect around others and attempting to close borders. On the other hand, you've got within research institutions and within the organizations that organize that research, a very strong focus on internationalization, interdisciplinarity, and applying blue sky research into real world outcomes. So those two things are sitting in contradiction with each other. But, the big picture is that, although we have a terrible situation in relation to this kind of legislative framework around the prevention of people coming to places like the United States, actually, my colleagues in Britain are completely the challenge for higher ed in Britain with the Brexit is extreme, because they've been integrated into a much bigger community for 15 or 20 years. So, and these also, higher education in a place like Australia generates 12% of the gross national product. You can't just suddenly say no foreigners, even though the government says that. Of course, the universities are engaged also in opening up as other institutions are trying to close them down. So what I see our role in this is, and it's an activist role, is very much to keep those kind of foci on the question of inclusion, on the question of participation, on the question of partnerships. Our program at the PhD program in theatre is an ongoing exchange partnership with Shanghai Theatre Academy in China. And so, I'm having to educate myself a lot about working with Chinese institutions. But the really productive aspect of that is the fact that 2 students every year come to us and stay in our program for a year. It's in its 3rd year, and it's building a longer term relationship between scholars. It's building a relationship between our students, our PhD students, and their PhD students. And it's educating both sides to this very complicated sort of possibility for some kind of future scholarly interaction and partnership. So it's very productive on those terms, because these are students who are coming and learning a lot about theatre cultures that they've never been experienced or heard about in their studies, and the same is true for us. So these long-term, I think these things are very productive. And even though we're working and that particular program is working within the context of what my Chinese colleagues keep calling the new Cold War between the United States and China. So on the ground, you go to a university, and professors and students are by nature people who want to communicate and look outwards. So I think that's the area that we need to expand and participate in.
Thank you.
I'll just add real quickly that, I'm sorry, would you, yeah, it's a really good question, thank you. And a lot of what we do in terms of international partnerships has to do with connections that I have through my own art practice and my own research. And it also, I guess, touches on this question that Peter brought up initially about the idea of art as a kind of research medium, which is now not so unusual in Europe to discuss things that way. It's very unusual in most of the United States to discuss things, art as a kind of research medium. And that's a bit of an interesting challenge that I find in my own institution, et cetera. But what I've been discovering lately is that, people overseas, even though they're very sympathetic to what we're doing, are, I think, perhaps reluctant, or even their institutions that would normally fund them are reluctant to give them the support to come over to the U.S. at this particular moment because of what's going on. So you have that contradiction, as Peter was saying. And it is part of this conflict between inability of neoliberalism to continue to accumulate capital and a nationalist model that's emerging, which thinks it's going to solve the problem, which we know is only going to make matters worse. And it's just, yeah.
I just want to make a comment a little bit about this discussion about international. First, let me thank the four of you for doing this. This has been
Thank you, John.
Fantastic. And I've learned a lot from you in these last couple of hours. So, and for us, it's very valuable to hear from you because we're so instrumental in trying to build programs to help you even advance your research agenda. So they're excellent presentations. On this international issue, I've been trying to work a little bit with the Chinese and trying to develop some partnerships lately. And I have to say, at the research, on the researcher level and the non-governmental level, people who are engaged in research and education, they're more than ever eager to partner with us, despite the fact that at the federal level is where the problem is. The local and state level, I think we can do a lot of things to pick up the slack from what's happening at the federal level, where we can to continue to develop these partnerships. So I think we have opportunity here, even though there is this desire to shut the country down internationally. I think at the local and state level, these are opportunities for us to try to work around those barriers that are being set up, so that we can continue to advance these partnerships. And I think the academic institutions have played a historic role in this in that whole effort. As the country becomes more isolated, academics become a lot more involved and engaged, and I think that presents us with some opportunities. We can do that. There are some questions that were previously asked about what we can do at the institutional level to make your jobs a lot easier. And my office, of course, has been very involved in trying to do that. There are challenges in CUNY in trying to do this. Part of it is because we're so huge and we're so big and we are so compartmentalized. And we've tried to overcome that, those varying degrees of involvement on the part of each of the institutions. But assuming no holds barred, what would you like to see us as administrators do to make your jobs a lot easier? What is your wish list, again, for us as administrators to make
I would start with getting to know what we're doing, and then setting up just an informal meeting even just to discuss, well, what kind of things might we be able to sort of assist you with? Here's some things that we have going on. Does it fit with what you're doing? Just that kind of discussion at that very first level would be extremely helpful to us, at least I know at Queens College.
One of the things that, because I work here at the Graduate Centre and our students are also researchers. and they're competing with students in PhD programs nationally and internationally that in some instances do have a research infrastructure for their work. So one of the challenge of us, of course, is to bring together the relationships that we have to fund our research, but also one of my concerns is to try and fund their research as well, because and this is something that's already very pronounced in the sciences as a funding model for PhD students, and there's a lot of conversations about that model moving into the social sciences and the humanities and whether that's good for us or not good for us. But one of the good things is that it's focused on students, and the other thing is it's very much this question of what constitutes research. It's the need to rethink what constitutes research. You were talking about the shift towards thinking about artistic practice as research or social activities as research. That conversation is really alive in my program. And to a certain extent, I'm involved in that because I come from a background where that was already available to PhD students, but it's being driven by the students. They're coming in and they're wanting that kind of possibility to think about how their work as practitioners or as activists and artists can be included in the research agenda. So, it's a wish thing, but, the challenge for our students is to make them as well funded as other students. So, yeah.
I would just add to that point to say that, speaking from the community college, to really see community colleges as vital sites of research and for support, because one of the challenges I feel as a person teaching 4 courses and then 5 courses is that I don't have time to look for grants, or, I support in all stages of the process, including understanding the kinds of projects that we're working on to identify where there may be matches or, good opportunities is something that would be really helpful. And I think also, to your point about compartmentalization, once, part of, because of my inexperience the first time I went through the process of having a big grant, managing the financial, payments and the different relationships between our grants office and the research foundation, one of the frustrations was that the compartmentalization meant that often I was sort of spinning in circles. And I think having more continuity across the offices, but also having personal relationships. I felt like I always knew who I could call at the research foundation or in my grants office, but sometimes I wanted all 3 of us to be in a conversation so that I wasn't kind of the bridge going back and forth to both offices. So some like back-end logistical, smoothness, I think sometimes would have helped just decrease how much time was spent in the actual administration of the grant versus the actual, project itself. So
I was going to just echo that point as well. It is the layers of system are daunting. And sometimes they feel like an asset, and sometimes they feel like an obstacle. And part of it is about is the hardest part, actually, I think, in administering these types of grants is you can usually figure out who you're supposed to speak to, but it's very hard to find a way to have those 2 people speak to each other. I also do want to just kind of give a big up to Dan, because I met with you guys I heard you talk at some other event a year or longer ago, and I walked up to Dan and I said, I would love to, I want to just sit and chat more. So he came out, he spoke to me as well as my colleague, and just to kind of spitball ideas, to think creatively about grant funding, because, similarly we're all under we have many other sets of responsibilities working in, a large public institution, and also being educators that take up lots and lots of time in addition to our research or our scholarly work. And so having time and opportunities to have conversations either in smaller groups, the most helpful things have been the kind of smaller workshops that I've attended, and then the one-on-one meetings to kind of just start to think about what's even possible, or to know, because there were things that we hadn't even thought of as possible funders. That was incredibly helpful.
Let me just reiterate the same thing. Dan's been fantastic. He's reached out to us, and we had great coffee together. But this event and also that John and Ingrid everyone put together is an example of the kind of thing that I think really helps. I don't get it at the local level, but it's here. So it's good.
the question of this teaching load is really crucial too. So teaching buyout needs to be really easy. And it should be a priority for some of the funding, I think, because you can't be an active researcher when you're teaching 5 courses a semester. And people who are running the programs at the community level and at the college level really need to be told that it's really good if your faculty are doing research. Sometimes I feel because I'm working with a colleague at BMCC, and the work there is, there's a lot of pressures to teach the courses. There's a lot of emphasis on pedagogy. That's really important. But also the fact that researcher is bringing that research into that environment's also really valuable for that institution. And the administrators and the department heads really need to embrace that idea.
So when I first came here, I realized how much emphasis at CUNY there is on education. And I realized how very little emphasis there is on research. And I think part of it is historical. Part of it is just the nature of the institution. Part of it is has to do with political pressures in terms of the bringing in large numbers of students through the system, But I think what is missing is the importance of research for education and what it adds to education. And I think we all have to recognize that best institutions are those where both of those are leveraged, where research leverages education and education helps research. And those are the best institutions. And I think as we develop our research agendas, I think we will also improve our educational practices and our ability to serve students as well. And I think that's is an important thing for all of us to keep in mind.
Should be up there at the top. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Effie McLaughlin. I'm the Director of Grants and Research Programs in the Central Office of Research, Vice Chancellor of Research. And I have to just tell you, my head is exploding. I could say about 9,000 things to all these issues that have come up. And I'd really also like to thank Dan and John. I've worked with them before, and we're sort of trying to collaborate more in terms of what the Research Foundation does to support faculty and research and what our office does. But the one thing that struck me that I'd really like to talk about more specifically is the question of how we define research and what is research. Because this is something that comes up in our office every day because what we do in our office is we develop programs to support faculty to do their research. And a lot of this is funded through internal funds, whether it's tax levy or it's F&A return. But we're constantly developing our programs and trying to figure out the best way to support, communicate with faculty to figure out ways that we can approach this to help them do the research. And in the past, historically, our office has focused a lot more on STEM research, on science research. And over the last few years, we've really been trying to broaden that through, we've developed, I actually recognize some faces, some names in terms of our book completion award. And I initiated a pedagogical research initiative, largely in the community colleges, to sort of help figure out ways, address this issue of balancing your teaching mission, your research mission, and helping, bring more of your own research into your classroom and figure out ways to do that. But the thing that I'm particularly interested in terms of how we define research, because the problem that you have, not the problem, but the question is, what is a researchable question, and how do we define outcomes? And what you want to know is how you measure outcomes. And this is, I'm just coming off last week, I was sitting on an NSF review panel for their division on education. And their division on education, even though it's at the National Science Foundation, these were innovations in graduate education, and they were working with art and design faculty, and they were working with writing centers, and they were working with, it's very interdisciplinary in terms of the people that are brought into these initiatives. But where it always sort of fell down is, how do we know that we're accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish? How do we measure outcomes? And I don't have any answers for this. I know for the most part, I would say faculty across the board aren't really doing a very good job of trying to figure out how to measure outcomes. And there are qualitative outcomes and there's quantitative outcomes. And in our office, we're scrabbling to also measure outcomes in terms of faculty and student success, in terms of, as you said, there's the traditional measures. There's publications, there's conference papers, and then for students, there's retention, there's graduation, there's, just head counts of numbers of students that are in programs. But what I would really like to engage with in this group is thinking more creatively in terms of defining what is research and how we measure outcomes in terms of, and I mean, I'm even thinking of some sort of measure of community engagement or some sort of measure of public engagement, something that we could take as developing metrics that would not only be good in terms of measuring our own success across the disciplines in the humanities, the social sciences, but then also something that we could take to national funders and say, we've really thought about this. These are measures that we've developed to determine whether or not our programs are accomplishing what they hope to accomplish. And as I said, I don't have any answers to this. I'm just saying that it would be great if we could have some sort of working group where we could sort of think about creative ways of measuring success for both students and faculty output. And I would love to hear anything you have to say about that.
I was going to say that one thing that jumps to mind, well, I would love to know the answer to that question too. But I think part of the question goes back to the issue that John was raising from before, which is which funders are we talking about, right? So because I'm kind of interdisciplinary, I know that if I'm writing an NIH or an National Institutes of Health grant, which I don't generally do because they have different sets of ways that they do research, they have often more rigid ideas about, or more, not rigid, specific ideas about what kinds of outcomes they're looking and seeking. Some of our direct service or programmatic grants also have these kind of a narrow set of outcomes like retention and attendance, and yet I also think that in conversation with program officers, that the program officers themselves, because there is also the constant pressure, not that I'm usually feeling sorry for myself, but I also feel the program officers are under an immense amount of pressure. The mechanisms that they're using are constantly changing. There's also different directives that they're hearing about what funding is kind of being seen as more central. Program officers themselves are also really trying to answer that question as well and trying to find creative ways to engage with that and to make clear the larger, broader benefit of the kind of the programmers' research that they're funding, what they're funding. But I think that part of it has to start in conversation with funders. So one thing that would be amazing if there was a working group is that it wouldn't only be people who are collecting data and doing research, but also the researched, whatever that means, but also the funders themselves to kind of hear how they are thinking and imagining it, because sometimes it's really clear when you look at the RFPs that come out. Usually you read it and you think like, I completely understand what they want, and then you start to look at it and you realize you have absolutely no idea what they actually want in terms of outcomes. So that would be really helpful if there was a working group that funders would be, or program officers would be on that, in that space as well.
Research is an original contribution to knowledge. So that can take the form of many different outputs and outcomes. And I think internationally there's been a lot of discussion in the creative arts and about validating certain kinds of artistic practice as research, and some of that's been extraordinarily valuable and productive, and perhaps some of it's also been a bit overconflated. And so in some institutional contexts you get some artistic practices research that you kind of look at and go, well, I'm not sure that's an original contribution to knowledge that's going to change the world. So the question of a robust discussion and a robust involvement of peers is very important, because ultimately, there's a principle within universities that there is peer assessment for research. And so having that discussion around the constitution of knowledge, or the framework of the constitution of knowledge, with the engagement of the people who make the knowledge is very important. Also, having an ability to communicate that to funders is very important, because they very often have a particular set of outcomes in mind, but then they're open to the conversation. If their justification is to fund research, well then that conversation around the way in which research has become an expanded field needs to be communicated to them. I think that's very important. I guess The third thing, there's a very interesting kind of emphasis at the moment within the Graduate Centre on a kind of knowledge transfer into more public-facing interactions. And so the Centre for the Humanities, the James Gallery, the Siegel Centre, for example, are three institutions here that are not only involved in transmitting the research of the university into a kind of public domain, but they're also making certain kinds of research. And, our program works very closely with the Martin E. Siegel Theatre Centre, which has a brief to produce public programs around the performing arts. But when I came here, I worked with Frank Henschke, the director there, and said, well, from my perspective, what you're doing is research. So let's think about it on those terms, and let's create some conversation around how that is research and communicate that idea, that intentionality of that institution to the stakeholders. So I think it's a conversation that definitely needs to be had. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just add that the essay I wrote for this book, it tries to address precisely that problem in terms of art as social action, and it really gets complicated because one of the things we try to do is take artists out of the classroom, put them in the community, and then they're working in a participatory way. They're not there to research the community, they're there to work with the community. And this goes against pretty much everything you think about in terms of objectivity and what your kind of knowledge base is, what epistemology is. The arts have traditionally critiqued all of those things, I mean, Marcel Duchamp took a urinal, put it in a museum, and raised questions about what constitutes the work of art, and that is one of the things we learn as avant-garde practitioners, let's say. So I think part of the problem is two completely different methodological approaches colliding, and I would not want to be in your position to have to sort that out, but I would say that maybe one has to get back and think about, in terms of outcome, what does it really mean, measuring outcome, to start with? Can that be applied in the same way to the arts as it is to the sciences?
Other public institutions in the United States, Berkeley has a very big social practice program headed up by an associate dean named Shannon Jackson, who's a leader in this field of producing knowledge around this. And they're very activity focused, and they have a very large public programs unit that combines the research that the faculty are doing with activities that artists are doing, and they kind of have a national focus there, and that's coming out of a public institutional context as well. So I think that's a very interesting model. Sorry, we're taking too much time, so next question.
Hi, thank you. So I have a couple of questions and points. I'm Cheryl J. Fish from BMCC English Department, and I'm a successful international researcher, but I've gotten funding in Finland as a Fulbright professor and from Sweden in environmental humanities. And so environmental studies is a very key thing we should all be thinking about, climate change and how we can do integrative education, including artistic practice, which I focus on, activism and artistic practice. So I guess I want to know what are grants I can apply for? What I would like to come away with today is actually getting some concrete information on where I could apply for, humanities supporting international grants, because just looking for grants takes up so much energy with our heavy teaching load. So it's just helpful if today anyone can name some names of good grants to think about for the arts and interdisciplinary programs for both our research and in our classroom, because clearly not everything I research I can bring to my classroom. I teach very basic level writing and literature at BMCC, so I can't bring all of my research on environmental justice in indigenous Sami areas in northern Scandinavia, which is what I work on, eco-media and art that's activist. So I'm looking for that. And the other thing is I'm a fiction writer and a poet, and I found within CUNY that a lot of these grant panels don't even include creative writers, like the book completion program that the previous questioner said she started. So how can we be in the running for things if we're in creative writing and if there aren't people on these panels that have backgrounds in the creative arts? I've been most successful as a scholar, and I also feel that I'm validated as a scholar whereas I'm not so validated as a poet and fiction writer, so I tend not to even apply in those areas. So I guess it's more comments as well as questions, so I hope we can come away today with some concrete places we can go. And then also, CUNY-wide, I think the fact that CUNY is so big and is so many people doing so many interesting things, and we don't know about each other. And then also the community colleges are often excluded from many, many activities, and you know, this is just a general gripe I have, and also in leading journals, you rarely see anyone from a community college on the board, on the panel. This is a profession-wide problem, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I can't hear you.
The Foundation Award does accept creative writing proposals.
Okay, maybe now it does, but like the first year, there was nothing about writing, and I often felt like, what would the learning outcomes be for a book of poetry, you know?
It's a challenging question. It's a very important question. And it's challenging because many, I mean, particularly around questions of climate and eco-critical theory, for example, they've become political issues for national funders, and so very often there's an unwillingness to fund these kind of topics within the national frameworks now because they've become so politicized. However, it's, you know, perhaps the defining topic of our age. So we really need to work in that area, and there's a lot of activity in the arts that are dealing with that. You know, I think if you're talking, I think partnerships are very important. I'm currently working with a colleague in Europe to run a conference on relationship between performance studies and ecology, and that funding is actually coming from the EU through a Capital of Cultures fund, because I'm working with a person who's both a scholar and the artistic director of the Rijeka National Theatre, and they're Capital of Cultures in 2020. So we're taking our conference there where, from their point of view, they want international scholars, so they're willing to fund a seeding conference for that. And then we'll articulate the themes at that seeding conference and then spread it among our membership of PSI, which is a peak body for performance studies, and then we'll have a large conference there. But, you know, the money is actually coming not from a traditional research infrastructure, but from an opportunity that has availed itself because of the 2020 focus on Capital of Cultures. And so to a degree, we're kind of attenuated to this idea of possibilities here. So I think and the challenge for that is that it's a chicken and egg thing. If you're teaching 5 courses a year, you can't go to the conference that you're going to meet the person that's going to tell you about that event. So,
and we only get $450 for travel at BMCC, by the way.
So, I mean, I understand the challenges there. But the possibility for partnerships is the way that those kind of projects are going to get up. The question of validating creative practice as research, I mean, that's a question that we need to advocate for here. Those battles have been fought elsewhere, and they're essentially in some ways over. You know, you can claim in my old university, my colleague in the creative writing program could claim a novel as an equal output alongside a research monograph. My colleagues in the visual arts program could list their exhibition as a bona fide exhibition as a research output, and that would be validated by the research infrastructure. So those battles were fought by people who were in the community saying, come on, you need to listen to this. The research paradigm's changed. It's not just old books or science projects. You know? Yeah.
I just wanted to add 2 quick things. One is that when I started teaching at BMCC, I also felt quite challenged about, you know, how to sort of translate some of my research and scholarly interests into intro-level courses. And I think actually applying for and conceptualizing public programs really helped me to think wider, and then it gave me new ideas for how to actually bring my research into the classroom, even at the very, you know, basic intro-level course. So I think there is room I think it takes some creative thinking, and it will look different than it would if you were teaching a graduate level course, but I actually feel like once I was able to sort out more of those entry points, it really helped me to feel more aligned and integrated. I mean, I think going back to your 3 legs in the stool, like, it helped me to understand better how I was seated, and to feel more connection between my students and whatever I was doing outside. So that's one thing. And second, just a BMCC specific thing is that our grants office, I don't know if it goes out to everyone, but our grants office has started to put together a newsletter with grant opportunities. And I used to ignore it because I thought it was I saw the beginning was mostly like NSF grants or other STEM related grant opportunities, but the newsletter is like 10 pages long, and actually I found some pretty great opportunities through that, so I think that's a good resource.
I was going to say there are also some opportunities for, I'm not in the creative arts, so it's hard, I don't know, I don't have specific names of grants, but one thing that was helpful was applying for smaller grants or fellowships through CUNY that were really helpful in actually building relationships with other scholars who are doing work that kind of brushed up against the edges of the kind of work that I do, and then ending up in informal conversation, usually around the free food. And I got that's where I got names for things that I've applied for that have been others, including other smaller, other grants through private foundations that have been successful to get, or other things like that. That was, that finding the kind of the side conversations were where I got those names. And similarly in other social media networking spaces that are specific to academics, so that, there's a million kind of secret Facebook groups with 15,000 people, but who, where opportunities are posted, and that's the other, so I mean, I do sometimes delete, and ignore the emails from the grants office, although those are helpful too, but those have actually been unexpected places where I've all of a sudden had no idea that even existed, and sometimes they're from places I thought they would never be at all, and they've been actually the most successful way that I've found unexpected grants.
Just very quickly, we have a rolling project called Trees of Tomorrow, which is about flushing trees, and people do sort of walking tours and discuss. We brought over a couple scholars, artists really, from Dublin to talk about guerrilla splicing, and we also work with the John Bowne High School, which is part of Queens College because they have an agricultural program. So that's the kind of rhizomatic way we kind of operate, and you're welcome to plug into it, and we have maybe new things coming up that you could be part of.
Environmental poetry, and I'm from Flushing.
Okay, so all the better. Yeah. Get in touch.
Next question?
It's not a question, it's a response to that question, actually. Large grants sometimes grow from small grants, and all of those in this audience who are part of the PSC CUNY Union are eligible for a PSC CUNY grant. Those research awards are not the largest grants. They range only up to $12,000, but they're an opportunity for you to fund your own research, travel, and also to fund your graduate students who could assist you in your work. You apply through the campus that is your payroll campus. I'm Adrienne Klein. I'm at the Research and Sponsored Programs office here at the Graduate Center, so I'd facilitate applications here, but on your own campuses, you'll find someone who's eager to help you get a PSC CUNY grant, and the deadline is December 15, so it's coming up. But there are awards in the sciences, the humanities, and the arts, and I'd be glad to share information. Actually, I have flyers here, so please look for me. Thanks.
I can't, yeah.
I know that with the adjunct development fund,
Sorry, can you use the microphone, please, because we can't hear. So.
I think he's asking if adjuncts qualify.
But I just wanted to say I can't stress enough how important these grants are, because from little things big things grow, and if you want to get a big grant, you need to show a track record. You need to show a development of a project, and this is the way to do it. This is the way to get something, get the narrative started, work the language, start doing some productive research, and then you can go for a bigger grant. Yeah. Just very quickly, because we do have other, so if you've got a comment, please, but yeah. No, please, but there's somebody else just waiting on the other side.
I do find that sometimes the PSC CUNY grant tends to favor the science model. I'm just going to put that out there, and it's often like, oh, what are your outcomes? What's your research question? And it's been challenging, really, to try to force fit what I do into what.
there are panels that read these that are made up of your colleagues.
Yeah.
So humanists are reading those applications from humanists.
Yeah. So
Understand that. I've gotten feedback and I noticed it. Wait, anyway, we'll have this conversation another time.
You just need to get on the panels. Yes, your question.
Thank you. My name is Alyssa, and I represent the CUNY Dance Initiative, which is a residency program for New York City choreographers and dance companies on 13 CUNY campuses across the boroughs right now. We work with a mix of community colleges and also the four-year colleges. And I am going towards a question. I feel like I'm a bit of an outlier here because I'm not faculty, but we do work with faculty in the academic programs as well as a variety of performing arts centers. And we have three goals. Obviously providing rehearsal space, performance opportunities to New York City dance choreographers and artists. And we want to connect with students and enrich their experience and education, and then long-term build audiences for dance. And I think I will be honest and say one of our challenges has been connecting with faculty. I know there are many extraordinary faculty at CUNY campuses, but to your point, they're also torn in many different directions between their teaching and research opportunities and responsibilities. So my question to you is, how can we best connect with some faculty? Because partnerships are the absolute foundation, truly, of this program. We've been going for 5 years, and we've made some kind of one-on-one connections with faculty at various campuses, but we're always looking for new ways to connect with faculty because that's often the entree into students.
I think there'd be a lot of connections to people in our program because we have a lot of people working on dance and musical theatre. And many of them come from practitioner backgrounds, so they'd be very interested to meet you, I'm sure. Practically, working at the Graduate Centre, we have no studio spaces, so
I know.
we need to be able to access because we're not primarily a practice-based institution, but if we bring in the discourse of practice as research, we obviously need to have some access to those kind of spaces for the students to do their work, and that's a really pressing issue for us. So practically space. So if we could connect, that'd be great.
Lovely. I'll follow up with you.
Another idea I have is contacting like the sports offices of the colleges because they often will run dance programs. Maybe you could recruit through that.
You're asking about like the Phi-Ed, sort of use old terminology. Some of the dance programs are actually still embedded within the larger physical education program. And so, I mean, obviously the dance faculty are incredibly committed and wonderful partners for us, but we're particularly interested in broadening the discourse, sort of outside the most immediate dance program to connect artists and faculty in other disciplines.
Could you repeat her name again?
Sorry, could you say your name again?
Sure. My name is Alyssa Alpine, and I coordinate the CUNY Dance Initiative. I'll be at lunch. We can talk.
Where's your office?
We are based at Queens College.
Great. Thank you. We've got a question over here.
Hi. I'd like to ask a very practical question, which is about strategies for deciding the timing of when to apply for grants. And I'm thinking of this both in terms of sort of the life cycle of a research project. Is it, sort of do you kickstart the project by applying for the grant, or does it come a little later in the process? And also in terms of, I guess, the life cycle of a tenure track professor, and how those of you who've gone through the grant-seeking processes on the tenure track have made decisions about when to apply for big grants and how you're going to manage them as part of your tenure process.
I guess there are two of us who are still in the tenure process. Honestly, it goes back to the same original point around kind of the relationships and partnerships and allies. Because of the broad range and the kind of quantity of the grants that we are administering, they are able to cover full-time staff who can help navigate some of the extended conversations with the RF. That being said, there are a number of different ways to kind of that I've been trying to think of timing the grants. Some have been more successful, some have been less successful. I try to look at the grants that are at the CUNY level or private foundation level, I try to actively seek out grants that are geared specifically either towards towards junior faculty that provide additional training and support that would actually help me to be able to learn how to even better administer these types of grants and write grants and be successful at continuing my research program. That has been incredibly helpful. Also, though, trying to read between the lines of how much actual time is being asked and required outside of the research component. And I mean, I literally just flew back yesterday from Chicago for a grant where I hadn't read the fine print quite as carefully about how many times I was going to have to travel within the grant, which sounded wonderful in theory. And then when it was November, I had a moment of panic. That's one part of it. The other thing is some of them are timed specifically only for junior faculty, but are best applied to at the end of your kind of tenure process. So, like the NSF Career Award is, or others that are meant to kind of support you to help kind of give you a little lift as you move towards submitting your tenure materials. But the main thing is actually having a set of people who you kind of like make real eye contact with and say, like, are we here? Are we here together? If this happens, are you signing on the dotted line? This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. And this is when we're going to build in the time to meet specifically. And also, I've been trying to think big and then break it down into little tiny chunks that I can eat. Applying for smaller grants to help build towards the bigger grants with the goal that when I hopefully get tenure, that then I'll be ready to kind of propel towards the much larger ones. Also because the larger grants are seeking, oftentimes they'll give feedback like we would like somebody who's not going through the tenure process, essentially, or more senior. They say other words, but that's what they mean.
Yeah, and I can just add, I mean, from my experience, not that it's necessarily a recommendation, but I didn't think so much, I wasn't as deliberate about the timing. So every grant I've applied for came out of some kind of organic process that was, it seemed like a good time for whatever reason to try to push this project forward. And I did have I did get some negative feedback from senior scholars about the NEH grant that I received because they felt like I was too early on to be focusing on something that was more of like a collective faculty development project instead of my own individualized scholarly agenda. And it didn't really bother me, but I do think that it slowed, participating in that project and leading it for 2 years, it wasn't that the other parts of my academic life were on hold, but they were impacted by the commitment that I had made. So, I think for me that worked out okay. And, because I was successful in obtaining that grant, that also helps me with my tenure process, though I've gotten mixed messages about where and how it helps. So we'll see what happens. But I think that, for us, we decided, the project team decided to pause on applying for future funding to continue that project so that we could all kind of, return back to some of our own independent projects. And so then I applied for a PSDQ grant and then a different grant. So I'm kind of now in a different direction, assuming that at some point we're going to return back to that project. So it's a little bit about, I think, balancing the time and thinking about what works for the project and then trying to find ways to support it. One mistake, or not mistake, but one thing I learned through this experience was that when we applied for this big grant, we didn't have any staff doing the administrative work. So I was frugal and didn't put any money in the budget for anyone to take care of the financial management or the grant reporting. I did all of that. And I think that, one thing I wanted to reflect on earlier was that even though we had a really great project team and it was super cohesive, there were a lot of moments in which I myself felt quite isolated because I had put myself in that position as the director and then I was solely responsible for that work. And I think if I were to apply for another large grant again, I would make sure that the project director was either officially or informally like a co-director model so that one person doesn't have that sole responsibility because ultimately that was what ate up my time, somewhat because of my inexperience of navigating the RF and our grants office and how to do things. But even with course releases that I had built into the grant to administer the grant, I still felt like there were really low points where I was like, up really late, crying, I can't believe I did this, I have stacks of, the website's not working, and I still have to teach tomorrow. And so there was a lot of stress involved, and I think, just to say, from the perspective of your question about the tenure track, thinking about time, that was an area where I could have saved time, and I wasn't thinking bigger picture. I was thinking I can save money and get more, people paid, I'll just do it. That was a mistake, yeah.
Before you step away from that question, I just wanted to let you know I've just returned from the annual meeting of the National Science Foundation, and this is a question that the big funding agencies are asking of grants administrators and professionals, that how does the culture change so that working on these kinds of big partnerships or even smaller projects that require that level of time and dedication to getting the grant and administrating the grant, how does that fit into tenure, and can that begin to be seen? Can we change the culture so that that kind of work is valued and seen as part of your tenure process? So that is definitely, you're hitting the pulse of what we're talking about. So we're hoping that over the next couple of years we can have that happen. Oh, you go ahead and answer that.
Can I just say one quick thing to that too, which is, I think in addition to my own kind of feeling of how did I get myself into this, I also felt like there was something irresponsible about not sharing that work, because at the end, now that the grant is over, I feel like, I learned all these skills, and now I have this practice and experience of navigating these systems, but the other people on the project team didn't get that level of experience. So I think in hindsight, that was also something that would have benefited others, and I wish I had thought of that ahead.
So to answer your question about at what point in your career you should be applying, at least most federal agencies have grants oriented for people at different points in their careers. Some are for graduate students, some are for individuals who just got their PhD, some grants are oriented early career faculty, some grants are oriented mid-career faculty. So I think it's more a question of trying to find the right match for where you are in your career. So, you can talk to our office and we'll help you through the process, okay?
Yeah, on that note?
There was one other point I wanted to make, which I forgot. Okay, on that note?
On that note, we would invite you all to join us in the Skylight Room so you can talk amongst yourselves, talk to us, and have lunch. And we want to give a round of applause for our fabulous presenters. This guy